Yes, this scene style is simple and the animation is by no means perfect. But there's a reason for it. This tutorial is possible thanks to the upcoming course Master Cinematic Storytelling in Blender. Stay tuned to learn more. Chances are you've done a lot of this in Blender. Probably quite a bit of this. A little bit of this. Lots of this. And maybe even this. But how often do you actually do this? Yes, I'm talking about cinematic direction in animated scenes. In other words, how often do you become a CG filmmaker? Unfortunately, quite rarely, right? It's a bit ironic, because I dare say that's actually the reason many of us got into the world of 3D, to make short films. But one does not simply jump into Blender to start practicing CG filmmaking, right? Well, you can. For more than 2 years now, I've been building a course that lets you practice 3D filmmaking with ease. I try to make the topic accessible and as simple and fun to learn as possible. All of my filmmaking knowledge, everything that I learned making game cinematics and short films, I poured into this one. This is a scene that I made for one of the chapters of the course, and while everything about it is quite basic, from the simple shading to the crude animations, this style has several huge advantages. Most importantly, anyone can make this. All the assets are free, all the animations are from Mixamo, and it's super fast to make. Above all, this gave me a chance to practice my CG camera work, framing, and timing of action. And that's exactly what you'll be able to practice too in my upcoming course. It's coming out soon, so definitely join our waiting list to not miss it. In this video, I'll break down the whole scene and its many elements, and then explain my process of putting together the animation and the camera work. It's not gonna be step by step, but I'll definitely include all the most important workflows. To create scenes such as these, you must have a clear idea in mind about what you want to make. And then make sure there are assets available for you both at Mixamo and BlendSwap, which is where I got most of the animations and the models. At first, I collected as many Mixamo animations that fit the concept, and then blended them together in Graph Editor to populate my scene. I then used very simple shaders and low poly models to not overcomplicate the process. The most time spent was on the camera work and the timing, which had to work together. So I simultaneously pushed around the animations and the camera motion to orchestrate the whole sequence. And now, let me break down everything. Oh, did I mention that I prepared this whole scene for you? Yep, that's right. You can download it from our CG Boost resources. I actually want you to get in and put your cameras in there. So after you finish watching this video, you can head over to our resources page and you'll be able to download everything from there. One day in the future, I would love to just jump to the drawing board, think about any animation that I want, and then tell a gang of animators what I want them to animate for me. Sadly, I don't really have that option at this point. And so, I began the other way, by looking at what animations I have at my disposal at Mixamo. And apart from a lot of default animations, lots of sword movement, zombies, and some weird stuff, I found lots and lots of animations of Modern Warfare. They were all just bits and pieces though, so first things first, I had to start connecting them together into longer actions. Right off the bat, I knew that I'd be working with cinematic frame rate of 24 FPS, so that's what I chose when downloading the character, along with FBX format. And I chose to download it with skin, because I would be using this character mesh. Once in Blender, I simply imported the FBX using the import dialog. And yep, it's there. Now let's say I have these three animations that I'm trying to connect together. First, a run cycle, then a crouch, and a bit of shooting. Well, there are several ways you can do this in Blender. One of them is, for example, using the nonlinear editor. It's a super powerful tool, but in this scene, I actually made do with just the graph editor for combining the animations. If you're interested in the NLA editor, you can explore our other courses, for example the Cubic Worlds, or this free video on our channel by Jim Moran. Now let me show you how I combine the animations. First, let's take this run crouched animation. I actually downloaded it with this in place parameter checked, so the character is running at one spot. The reason I decided to do so is that now, when I go to the graph editor and choose to copy this whole animation with A to select it, then Ctrl C, and go to the first empty frame after the animation, hit Ctrl V to paste it several times. Yep, the whole thing loops. Compared to if I'd done it without having the in-place checker on, the character would go to the end of the cycle and then return. Which is something that I could fix later, of course, but why make my life more complicated than it is? Now that I have this animation looping several times, I want to take this second armature and then go to pose mode, select all of the keys, hit Ctrl C, and then go back to the original armature and paste it all like this right after the looping animation. Now what happened is this character makes those several run cycles and then it starts off from the origin point and finishes the run to crouch animation. Of course, we actually don't want him to run just on one spot for these run cycles, but we'll animate that in a moment. Right now, let's finish combining the animations by adding the fire rifle animation at the end. Select all the keyframes, paste them after the last keyframe, and whoops, the character jumps to the origin point. Now the key to solving both these issues, the static part of the run cycle and the jump here, is to play with the location of the root bone of this character, meaning the one that controls the position of the armature. Various character setups have this bone at various places, but you can always figure it out by going to the pose mode with Ctrl Tab, and then here in the outliner, unfolding this pose drop-down menu. The very first bone you find here is the one controlling where your character is placed. And in case of Mixamo characters, it's this hip bone here. So right here in the graph editor, let's have a look at the keyframes of this bone. But before that, let me actually do something I do every time when I import my Mixamo animations. The FBX armature actually comes in with all these scale parameters keyframed. But they don't animate at all, it just adds more clutter here in the graph editor. So I usually just select all the bones with A, and here in the search menu, I type in scale. That filters out just the scale keyframes, and I delete them all. Now back to the hip bone, select it, and let's see. Expand this left menu to see the name of our keyframes, and also let's hit this normalize option, which changes the display of the animation curves so that they all fit into the window, ranging from bottom to the top. Currently we are interested in just these location data, so we can hide the rotation curves with these eye icons. And let's actually isolate just the Z location data. So select it and hit Shift H to hide everything else but this channel. Now what do we have here? Based on the coordinates of the hip bone, it moves in space in the Z-axis. It reaches this last point of the animation, and once the other animation starts, it jumps back to this place, as indicated by this sudden change in the curve. So what we can do now is to select these keyframes that are way down here and just hit G to move them and Y to lock them in the up and down axis and push them all the way up here until the curve is nice and smooth. And that immediately solved the biggest issue with the jump. But there is still a bit of a jump here on the X location curve. So let's fix that as well. And now just to be sure, let's check the Y-axis, but this one seems to be mostly fine. And that's it. That's how you fix these jumping issues when stringing similar animation types from Mixamo together in Graph Editor. Of course, this is not an all-powerful solution. You cannot expect to just string together, let's say, these two animations that are very different. That would require a lot of manual animation work to fix. However, when it comes to these modular animations, they can be put together easily as long as the poses are close enough. Now let's fix the static animation at the beginning. Let's see, it's static right until here, where the movement on Z location starts. The way I like to animate this in Graph Editor is to delete all the frames, just leaving the first one. Then I push it down until it's kinda in the same angle as the rest of the animation, and I watch the feet of the character real close. They mustn't be sliding, that would mean it moves too fast, and they mustn't be dragging, that means they move too slow. Adjust the Y position of the keyframe until it starts working for you. And the best thing is, for these simple scenes, it doesn't need to be totally perfect to work. That's how I went about stringing together all of these various animations. And in the course, I do this a lot because really, there is a lot of possibilities there, just waiting for you to put together into animated scenes. The second free resource I knew I wanted to loot was BlendSwap. Fortunately, from my initial research, I knew that there is also a ton of Modern Warfare assets for free there. So, for example, this amazing kit full of US soldier gear. Or these weapons. This Humvee. Even this freaking Black Hawk helicopter. Everything I needed was here, and the only question was how to put this all onto my characters. I usually start by putting all my assets into a single blend file, and I place their origin point exactly where I expect to append them at my characters. So for stuff like helmets or this body armor, I just put the origin to the geometry so that it's at the center of the mass. Then I take this object, I shift select the armature and hit Ctrl Tab to get into the pose mode. There I select the bone I want to parent to and hit Ctrl P, bone. And now when the characters start moving, the gear is appended. For the guns, I choose a different bone, which is this hand one. And in that case, I want to have the origin point at the spot where the gun is held, which is right around the handle and the trigger here. That's how easy it was to transform my Mixamo mannequins into something resembling soldiers. When it comes to the gear, yes, I got inspired by the movie Black Hawk Down, but please do not eat me alive if there are some inaccuracies. I'm definitely not a military expert. To make the Humvee and the Black Hawk models move, I used two simple techniques. First, there was the follow path constraint. I simply made sure that the Humvee is joined into one object. I put its origin down on the ground and to the center of its mass, and then the wheels I actually kept separate to be able to animate them turning by just keyframing this rotation axis. And of course, I parented those to the main Humvee mesh. Then I created a Bezier curve leading all the way from back here to the heat of the action over here. And by using this follow path on the Humvee, I was able to animate it along this curve by keyframing this offset parameter. I just made sure that I have the follow path checker active and also that I've chosen the correct axis. To be honest, I usually have no idea which is the correct axis. I just shuffle through these until I hit the right one. Instead of parenting, you can, by the way, always use this child of constraint as well. This is what I did here for the weapon of the Humvee gunner. You just specify a target. In this case, it's the right hand of the gunner. Usually the object then jumps away, but no problem, just hit the set inverse and that will fix the offset. One advantage of this workflow, instead of straight up parenting, is here you can actually choose which parameters will be parented. So for example, if you wanted this Browning gun to follow the Humvee location, but not follow its rotation, you could do that. So now it follows along, but it doesn't rotate with the car, which is kinda more realistic. When it comes to the rotors of the helicopter, I just added one keyframe to the corresponding rotation axis, which is Y for the smaller one and Z for the bigger one. And on each, I added a generator modifier, which basically generates continuous rising curve, and you can control its speed here. But one was actually quite fine in this case. For simple scenes like these, my main concern was to make everything, well, simple. Most important was to not waste time on details, and also to have smooth viewport playback, which is always the issue in Blender. And so, what I could make with planes, I made with planes. The ground, the clouds, even the explosions, which are not really the topic of this tutorial, But I can tell you that they were hand-painted frame by frame in grease pencil, which is a topic I'm starting to enjoy a lot these days. Well, anyway, you can freely download these effects from our project files. They are part of the scene. There is even the option to activate the outline for it here. The mountains were super simple as well. I just generated them in the built-in ANT Landscape add-on. I scaled them however I wanted and then placed them all around the scene. For the layers of atmosphere, I actually used a cylinder, and on it I made a material and used a gradient texture there. I plugged it into the alpha channel, switched it to blended mode to get rid of this unnecessary noise. Then I switched to smooth shading with right click. And then I just added a mapping node and coordinates node, plugging it together like this, and then rotating on this axis for it to go from bottom to top. And voila, I had levels of atmosphere almost for free, which I could color and layer on top of each other however I wished, and they surrounded my whole scene. The sky itself was a dome shape, basically just a cut of sphere, and on it another gradient texture, which I colored using the color ramp. And it gave the bottom the color of sand, but it transitioned gradually into blue hues of the sky. I plugged it both to the base color as well as the emission color here for it to emit the colors onto my scene. I really like the color combination that it created for my scene. The bright yellows complemented by the blues. That's a winning combination. The clouds themselves were just masked out photos that I plugged into the alpha channel. I continued with a simple aesthetic, even for the buildings where I placed the enemy soldiers. It's just a box with a few simple door frames and some railing, but not much else. Same goes for the small rocks and the trees that I scattered across the terrain using a very simple particle system. I just painted a few weight maps on the ground and then plugged them into the density vertex group in the particle system. For the absolute majority of my shaders, I just used principled BSDF and I varied the colors and the roughness. There were two exceptions though. The first one I learned from our very own Zach Reinhardt in his Blender Launchpad course. There he used the normal coordinates of an object and plugged them into the separate color node. If we preview this normal map, you can see that it's indicating the various world axes by these colors. Up is blue, depth is green, and side to side is red. What this separate node does is it allows Blender to create a mask based on these axes. So since I chose the blue one, which is the Z-axis, whatever was up was masked white and whatever was down was masked black. Now when you plug this setup into a mix color node, you can now blend between two colors on a completely automatic basis. And whatever is up will be the second color, whatever is down will be the first color. And in the end, I just plugged a color ramp here to play with the contrasts. That's probably the most elaborate shader I used for the scene. To give more variety to my ground, I also painted a vertex color map, making these sorts of lines, guiding the eye a little bit towards the building here. It's subtle, but it's there. I then just used the attribute node, typing in the name of my vertex color map here, and I once again used it in a mix color node. Whatever was black was this lighter color, whatever was white became this darker color. In short, I got majority of my elaborate assets from BlendSwap, and everything else I modeled and shaded in as simple form as possible. There was just one exception, these rocks that I got from this amazing Polynature pack. I wholeheartedly recommend you to buy the whole thing, because it's basically all you need for these sorts of simplified environments. Have no fear, however, we actually ship a portion of these assets with the course. So everyone will be able to build their simple environments using assets that we'll provide. In the end, I wanted to make everything in this scene super simple because the aim was to get to the cinematic part as fast as possible. And that is where the real fun begins. Before we dive into the cinematic breakdown, let me tell you about the upcoming course. In Master Cinematic Storytelling in Blender, I put all I know about creating cinematic looking images into 8 hours of lessons. that will guide you from values to colors, from framing to composition, from cinematic tools to sequences of shots. All that using only Blender and other free tools. Think of it as one of those fancy books on art and cinematic fundamentals, only in form of video lessons. By the end of the course, and after going through numerous exercises, you'll be able to confidently dive into short film creation, knowing your fundamentals are solid. So if it sounds good to you, definitely join our waiting list. The link is in the description. It's important to realize one thing. It may be fairly obvious when I say it, but it's the thing that really makes 3D filmmaking so exciting. You have the control over the characters, over the timing, the cameras, the lights, over everything at any time. In live-action cinematography, you capture your shot, and that's it. Not much editing freedom afterwards. Definitely not compared to CG cinematography. Here you can change anything at any time. The options are infinite, so much so that you may actually feel overwhelmed by them. So many questions. Where do I place this character? Where do I push this house? When do I make the Humvee enter the shot? Or when to make the helicopter hit the building? And that's why it's so important to learn this stuff and to get these sorts of sandbox scenes where you can practice the skill of cinematic timing, having a chance to orchestrate the cameras, the animations and the various key events into a nicely flowing whole. Know the story. That's what you'll hear me say many times. But what does it actually mean? It means to give a soul to your 3D scenes, some sort of story backdrop. You always need to ask yourself what is happening here, who are you looking at, and what is the stuff that's happening about. Even simple answers ahead of the process will make it infinitely easier for you. In my case, I actually watched some of my favorite war movies, including the Black Hawk Down, of course. And while I didn't really choose any particular scene to recreate from there, it gave me inspiration. I knew I wanted to make an ambush scene. An unspecified enemy is hidden in some buildings and it jumps a group of soldiers. What begins as an unfavorable situation for the soldiers, however, quickly turns around, especially when the helicopter arrives. On top of that, I thought about which style of camera work would suit this situation. And I always wanted to try out this sort of handheld documentary style camera animation. Thinking about the story, it actually felt best to stay with these guys, to show the action from the ground and make it feel like there is a cameraman walking in between them. A simple thought process immediately drives a lot of your creative decisions, and I can't stress enough how important these initial decisions are. Armed with a fairly clear idea in my head, I usually start my animation and assembly process from the main action. I ask myself, how do I want to start this action and from whose perspective? So here, I wanted the camera to follow these main two guys. I named them Mr. Crouch, because he later crouches, and Mr. Prone, because he lies down. These two were actually the very first animations I added, and everything else snowballed from there. So I thought, okay, the guy with the camera is probably walking with our soldiers, following behind them, when suddenly, blast. Which meant I had to add some sort of character here, and some sort of explosion effect. The camera move started with a simple empty that I used for animating the location of the cameraman. I made it to move forward and then towards these stones over here. And onto this empty, I parented my main camera. I may be in the minority, but I actually never use any fancy camera setups for my shots. Usually just one empty that drives my camera's position, and in some cases a few constraints for the camera, but that wasn't even the case in this shot. By the way, I dedicate a whole chapter to camera work in the course. So after the blast, I thought the cameraman would probably be stunned, hit by the force wave. So I added a little rotation animation on the x-axis onto the camera. This is how I make these more complex moves. I first animate the camera movement on the empty, and then you could go in and keyframe this rotation parameter on the camera at various key stages of the animation, but there is actually a quicker way. You add one keyframe at the beginning of the timeline to activate this keying set, and then enable the auto keying. With that, you can use the walk navigation mode to quickly point the camera wherever you want it to aim. In my opinion, this is a superior way of keyframing the rotation of your camera and so much quicker than hand keying these parameters every time. Now, before we go on, for those of you wondering why the empty shifted here at this point, it's just to make it better visible as opposed to when it lays on top of the camera. The camera is still moving with it, so nothing has changed in the setup. And now back to the animation. So the brave cameraman recovers quickly, and the first thing he does, he runs closer to cover. First I thought he would check on Mr. Crouch to the left, maybe thinking if he can duck behind him. And already at this point, I felt like more should be happening here. So I added more Mixamo animations here, and copied the original RPG Blast. Now there is Mr. Prone on the right, so I wanted the cameraman to check on him as well, maybe drawn by the sound of his rifle firing, and I also wanted to keep this building over here in view. So while the location empty was almost stationary, just walking behind the lying soldier, the camera was rotating all over the place. And now I wanted the cameraman to slowly start shifting to the right, like he's actually finally crouching and trying to get over the sniper to a better cover behind these rocks. So I made the empty go here, and the camera itself was always rotating to follow the action. So it goes up to follow the throw of the grenade. After that, I focused on the incoming jeep and what's happening on the building by just rotating the camera, and then all of a sudden, bam! Another explosion, first on the Humvee and after that from the Black Hawk. In these handheld shots, it is always important to think like a cameraman, so he wouldn't probably pan up to the helicopter right away. Instead, there would be a little lag before he realized what happened and pointed the camera up. These little details make everything more organic. Finally, the cameraman sees that all is safe, and in that moment I keyframed the Z location on the camera empty and made him get up like this, and then keyframed the rotation of the camera to finally look at these guys. And look, a duplicate of the original Humvee. A big part of the camera work in this scene was also a dynamic focal length, aka zoom in and zoom out, and then the camera shake. The first one I achieved by simply keyframing this value here and then choosing proper moments to zoom in on key actions or zoom out to reveal more of the scene. It's a simple graph editor curve and I played with it quite a lot. It's better to only zoom in when there is something new to focus on, a new part of the action or a detail you want to point out. Don't go zooming around haphazardly unless you want your audience to get confused. These days I do most of my camera shake using this free Shakeify add-on by Ian Hubert and Nathan Vegdahl. In my opinion, this should be built in. It's absolutely indispensable for me. Just have a look at the animation without the shake and with. In the camera settings, in this menu down here, you can choose from several types of shake. Adjust the influence, scale of the shake, and also its speed. And you can even combine various types together, which is what I often like to do in these sorts of shots. I use, for example, the wedding for soft stationary shake, or the investigation for a more nervous shake. Then for explosion, I often add this spaceship type. And finally, to simulate the cameraman walking about, I employed the Handycam run. I just lower the speed. And then I just keyframe the influence on these. And I play with the curve again to make these various types of shakes more or less intense at various points in time. Of course, this action-driven, frenetic camera style is just one way I could have gone about filming this scene. I could have, for example, chosen cool camera angles and cut between them in the timeline using these camera bind markers. I could have also shown more of the other side of the shootout, or I could have made several scenes in my blend file and cut between them in the sequencer. All that I focus on in my upcoming course, Master Cinematic Storytelling in Blender. I just love the constant back and forth of creating these 3D scenes. The process of making thousands little decisions, endless stream of big and little adjustments that will eventually get you to the final result. But the thought process I described in this video is in fact just a final stage. What lies underneath all these little decisions is something even more important. It's the fundamentals, the various parts of the artistic process that need to come together and work in harmony to make a good-looking image. From contrast to color, from framing to composition, from shot to sequences. You need to know your way around all these topics to make good decisions as a cinematic artist. In the upcoming course, I will explain all these fundamentals translated to Blender. It's like a film school for 3D artists. So until next time, stay creative my friends, Martin out.